The year is 1907. We are deep within the industrial heart of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. To the outside world, this city is the forge of the future, the engine of the American dream. But here, inside the cavernous belly of a steel mill, the atmosphere is not merely hot, it is combustible. It is a place where the air itself possesses a physical weight, pressing down on your lungs, tasting of sulfur, ash, and pulverized metal. In front of you stands the blast furnace. It rages with a ferocity that seems to defy the laws of nature, radiating a heat so intense that it instantly scorches exposed skin, leaving it red and raw within moments. Above, plumes of thick black smoke choke every breath, creating a perpetual murky twilight. In this world, the sun is obscured by the output of industry. Day and night are indistinguishable, and swallowed by the gray haze. Inside the stack, the iron glows with a luminosity that is nearly too bright for the human eye to bear, a blinding, violent, white-hot core. Beneath your feet, the floor vibrates with a low, constant hum, a terrestrial tremor caused by the sheer, unbridled power of the machinery. In this environment, men endure 12-hour shifts. They labor relentlessly, standing just feet away from open flames that mimic the temperatures of the surface of the sun. Their bodies and their nerves are pushed to the absolute breaking point, balancing on the razor's edge between exhaustion and hypervigilance. Looking back at this era from the comfort of the modern world, one is forced to ask a haunting question: was this truly control? Or was what happened here simply the brutal, non-negotiable price of industrial progress? This is the story of the early blast furnaces. These were machines designed to run non-stop for years, holding rivers of molten iron day and night, risking the lives of every single man who dared to step foot inside. It is the story of a system built on painstaking, dangerous work, where the line between an industrial triumph and a catastrophic disaster was measured in mere inches of brick and degrees of heat. Part 2. The Romance of the Inferno. It is difficult for the modern mind to fully comprehend, but at the height of the Second Industrial Revolution, these blast furnaces were not referred to as threats. They were not seen as health hazards or environmental disasters. They were spoken of as the crowning achievements of civilization. In 1884, one of the nation's most respected ironmakers stood before a gathering of his peers. He described the furnace not as a lethal hazard, but as something closer to a divine calling. His words, recorded in the annals of industrial history, paint a picture of jarring contrast to the gritty reality of the shop floor. He said, "Everyone engaged in the blast furnace practice recognizes the fascination connected with the business. It is manly, solid, and yet with sufficient romance and excitement to emphasize attraction. The plant itself is noble, from the breathing, pulsating machinery to the delicate digestive features of the crucible." He went even further, romanticizing the very pollution that choked the city. He claimed, "What to the uninitiated is the lurid glare of burning gas casting fitful shadows against the sky is, to the furnace man, and the index of the character of the work being done." To the wealthy industrialists of the era, the magnitude of the business was alluring. They believed that the courage, energy, and ability required to tame the furnace offered an opportunity to gratify praiseworthy ambition, causing a man to glory in the occupation. Reading those words today, they sound overly romantic, perhaps even delusional. However, we must understand that in their time, these words were practical. This psychological framing was necessary. The furnace had to be trusted because the entire American economy depended on it. And, crucially, the operators knew a terrifying truth. Once a furnace was lit, stopping it became the most dangerous decision of all. Part 3. The Physics of No Return. In the early 1900s, blast furnaces were designed to operate without interruption from the moment of ignition until the end of their campaign. A campaign could last for years. What looked like standard, robust operation from the outside was, inside the walls, a fragile balance held together by constant heat. American ironmakers had learned a hard lesson through the laws of physics. Cooling a furnace was not a pause, it was a risk. The structural integrity of the massive tower relied on thermal expansion. The brick linings inside expanded and settled under the immense heat, sealing the structure tight. If that heat vanished, the resulting contraction could fracture the interior beyond repair. Even worse, the molten material inside could solidify into a massive block of useless iron, a phenomenon known as a frozen bear or salamander, which often meant the furnace had to be dynamited and rebuilt from the ground up. Restarting a furnace after a full cool-down was a massive financial loss and a technical nightmare. Consequently, the pressure on the production lines manifested this physical reality into unyielding policy. According to federal surveys published at the time, a single large American blast furnace could produce more than 400 tons of pig iron in a single day. That amount of output could never be achieved with a start-stop mentality. Every idle hour translated directly into lost material, lost revenue, and lost dominance in the market. This meant the furnace remained lit through every scenario imaginable. Through blinding winter blizzards, during severe labor shortages, and amidst extreme mechanical strain, the fire had to burn. Crews worked around the clock to keep the air flowing and the molten iron moving, even when warning signs appeared. Small cracks in the steel shell, unusual, rhythmic vibrations in the floor, or subtle shifts in the color of the flame were noted, but unless they posed an immediate, catastrophic threat, they would rarely halt production. Operators constantly found themselves at a crossroads. Did they risk structural damage by letting the fire die to make a repair? Or did they trust that the beast could hold together for one more day? Without the sensors, computers, and monitoring technology that exist today, this judgment relied on pure experience rather than measurement. It was a gamble made in the dark, or with human lives as the chips. Part 4. The Origin of Pig Iron. To understand the industry, one must understand the product they were dying to create. The term pig iron is ubiquitous in steel history, but its etymology offers a fascinating glimpse into the early, primitive methods of casting. Pig iron is the intermediate product of smelting iron ore with a high-carbon fuel, such as coke, usually with limestone acting as a flux to remove impurities. The process involves smelting iron ore in blast furnaces, utilizing a violent chemical reaction to strip the oxygen from the iron. The term pig iron dates back to the era when hot metal was not poured into giant ladles, but cast directly into ingots in sandbeds right on the casting floor. The molds were dug out of the sand in a specific branching pattern. A central channel, or runner, or carried the molten iron down the line, feeding into smaller molds arranged at right angles. To the workers of the time, often agrarian men moving to the city for work, the group of molds resembled a litter of sucking pigs nursing from their mother. The main runner was called the sow, and the ingots were called the pigs. Hence, pig iron. By 1900, the United States was producing over 13 million tons of this material annually. It was the skeleton upon which the modern world was being built: skyscrapers, bridges, railways, and the demand for it was insatiable. Part 5. The Shadow of the Mills. The danger of the furnace did not stop at the factory gates. It trailed the workers all the way home. By the turn of the century, steel towns grew outward from the stacks like a fungus, placing daily life within reach of constant heat and noise. In 1900, neighborhoods rose alongside mills because the technology demanded workers be available around the clock. There was no commuting from the clean suburbs. You lived where you worked. Homes sat under a blanket of drifting smoke. Graphite dust coated the windowsills and ruined the laundry hanging on the line. Windows rattled as blasts roared through the night. Families learned to sleep through the vibrations of the machinery. Children grew up watching the sky glow blood red after sunset, a man-made aurora borealis caused by the dumping of slag. The furnace never rested, and neither did the communities built around it. Work inside the plant followed the same relentless rhythm. 12-hour shifts were common, dictated by the need to keep iron moving without interruption. Men crossed catwalks slick with condensation and slippery slag, guided by memory and habit more than sight in the dim, smoky interior. The scale of the industry amplified the exposure to danger. With hundreds of furnaces operating continuously across industrial regions, the statistical probability of disaster increased. Halfway through a shift, as the heat pressed against their skin and their ears rang from the blast, workers would find themselves asking the same silent questions. Were these environments places of work? Or were they zones of catastrophe simply waiting to happen? The hazards weren't always dramatic explosions. Poisonous gases seeped from cracks. Extreme heat slowly weakened supports. Fatigue dulled judgment. Many accidents unfolded slowly, the result of cumulative strain rather than sudden failure. Engineers and managers were not blind to these dangers. Trade journals of the era warned repeatedly about furnace proximity and worker exhaustion. Yet they offered few alternatives within the existing system. Simply put, production demands outweighed the logic of relocation or redesign. Living next to the furnace meant accepting its presence as normal. The glow, the noise, the risk, all blended into the daily routine. Catastrophe wasn't a sudden shock. It was the air they breathed, woven into every hour of the day, 24/7. Part 6. The Invisible Killer. And that brings us to the most terrifying aspect of this era. As we just mentioned, the furnace didn't need to burst to kill. In the years before the First World War, danger moved eerily through the steelworks, carried by air that looked harmless, but was anything but. By 1912, the engineers were openly warning that the most lethal threat inside a blast furnace plant could not be seen at all. It wasn't the molten iron, it was the gas. Blast furnace gas drifted through cracks in the masonry and loose fittings in the pipework. It was a byproduct of iron making, vented, reused to heat the stoves, and often poorly controlled. Contemporary technical literature described this gas as containing between 20% and 30% carbon monoxide. This was a concentration capable of killing a human within minutes in a confined space. The men working near uptakes and stoves learned to recognize warning signs, but usually it was too late. Carbon monoxide is odorless, colorless, and deceptive. The first symptoms, headache, dizziness, and confusion, mimicked the effects of heat exhaustion. And in a steel mill, a heat exhaustion was just part of the job. I'd imagine that halfway through a shift, a man's mind would wander. He would feel his legs growing heavy, his thoughts becoming thick. He would think, "I'm just tired." He would wonder, how many deaths were blamed on weakness, when in reality, the actual cause was poison? The design of early plants made escape difficult. Gas channels ran overhead, valves leaked, and ventilation depended on natural drafts rather than mechanical fans. A slight change in wind direction could push deadly fumes back into work areas without warning. To make matters even worse, the code of brotherhood among workers often led to tragedy. Rescue attempts frequently claimed additional lives when others rushed into gas-filled zones without respiratory protection to save a fallen comrade. What do you think? Were these deaths caused by poor ventilation, aging equipment, or the sheer difficulty of containing gas inside a furnace that never cooled? While each explanation held some truth, none fully resolved the risk. As long as the fire burned and iron kept producing, poisoned air was treated as an acceptable cost of keeping the furnace alive. Part 7. The Structural Betrayal. If the gas was the invisible killer, the breakout was the violent, spectacular one. Around 1910, blast furnaces across the industrial Midwest were aging under constant heat. Their interiors were slowly eroding. Ironically, the very process that created the value, the smelting, worked relentlessly to destroy the container. Refractory brick linings wore down as molten iron, and slag scoured their surfaces day after day. Engineers of the period noted that erosion was uneven. This created thin spots in the walls that absorbed more heat and stress than the rest. These weaknesses rarely showed themselves at first. External signs offered only tiny hints. There might have been a subtle bulge in the steel shell, a new vibration felt through the floor, possibly even a slight shift in how heat radiated from a familiar surface. So if the crew learned to notice these changes, why wouldn't they raise a red flag? Well, as we mentioned, stopping the furnace to investigate was rarely an option. It was frowned upon. It could be grounds for termination. Questions always presented themselves. Was the structure still strong enough to endure, or had it already crossed a line that no one could see? Industry journals described furnaces operating for 10 years or more without a full shutdown, far beyond what early designers had envisioned. Each additional year increased output, but it also compounded the hidden damage inside the walls. Repairs were performed on the fly while the fire continued to burn. Brick was patched, plates were reinforced, and leaks were sealed, all within feet of molten iron. These interventions reduced immediate danger, but did not restore original strength. I think it's safe to say they bought time, not safety. No single crack doomed a furnace. Failure emerged from accumulation, from countless small compromises layered over years of heat and pressure. Part 8. The Breakout. When the walls finally failed, there was no alarm. Failure arrived as a rupture. Breakouts were a known but poorly predictable hazard. These were moments when molten iron escaped containment and turned the shop floor into a river of fire. Stop and think about that for a second. Being one of these men, essentially surrounded by molten lava. It's such a scary thought to even consider. The furnace walls were never meant to be breached, yet they were asked to endure constant thermal stress. When the brick linings thinned, the shells distorted, and pressure sought the weakest point. When that point gave way, iron did not drip, it surged. Industrial workers of the era described breakouts where molten iron burst through furnace jackets and flowed across floors, burning through rails, steel columns, and anything else in its path. The iron cooled only after destroying what lay before it. By 1915, the United States was operating well over 300 active blast furnaces nationwide. According to federal surveys, each one held thousands of tons of molten material at any given moment. A single failure was localized, but unfortunately, the broken system all but guaranteed they would occur repeatedly. What made these events especially dangerous was their speed. Once containment failed, there was little time to react. Training mattered, but distance and luck often mattered more. Breakouts rarely made headlines unless lives were lost. More often than not, they were absorbed into operational memory as the price to pay for ongoing production. In the years just before 1920, furnace crews described moments when a machine that had seemed stable suddenly turned violent. The fire did not flicker. It struck back. Night shifts were especially vulnerable. Fewer supervisors were present. Visibility was reduced. Fatigue slowed a man's reaction time. A blocked tap hole or sudden pressure imbalance could transform routine work into chaos within mere seconds. Blast air entered furnaces at temperatures exceeding 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit, forcing reactions that depended on a precise balance between heat, flow, and pressure. When that balance slipped, internal forces surged unpredictably. Engineers wrote that pressure could reverse direction inside the stack, pushing gases and molten material toward openings never meant to release them. Some incidents hurled debris across casting floors, while others sent fire shooting from charging platforms. Basically, these men were caught in a living nightmare. What made these nights unforgettable was how quickly they happened. Once the furnace reacted, there was no gradual escalation. The men ran for their lives, blinded by glare and smoke. It was only because of their instincts and familiarity with the terrain that they were able to escape alive. Part 9. The Gamble of the Shutdown. This may sound impossible to believe, but stopping the furnace was actually considered the most dangerous act of all. Iron makers had decades of experience showing that shutdowns carried risks as severe as any breakout. A full shutdown required weeks of controlled cooling. Engineers warned that once cooled, a furnace might never be safely restarted. What choice would you have made in their place? Economic pressure reinforced that fear. Federal surveys show that American pig iron production exceeded 39 million tons by 1917, driven in part by the insatiable demands of the First World War. Furnaces were pushed to remain online because national output and the war effort depended on their continuity. There were numerous cases in which cooled furnaces cracked internally, revealing damage only after attempts were made to relight them. Some units required partial demolition. Though rare, others were abandoned entirely. The financial losses were significant enough to influence the industry-wide operating culture. Managers, therefore, favored basic patching while continuing work instead of completely shutting down. These interventions reduced immediate danger but preserved the underlying gamble. Who actually benefited from this arrangement? The logic was self-reinforcing. The longer a furnace ran, the more costly shutdown became. Each additional year increased dependence on continuous fire, making the idea of pulling the plug feel reckless rather than prudent. They did not refuse to stop because they ignored danger. They refused because stopping had been engineered into a risk no one believed they could afford. And because, in my opinion, as absurd as it sounds, it is human nature to let greed and necessity outrank caution. Part 10. The Human Toll and the Illusion of Control. Loss was woven into the work long before it made the news. Injuries were common enough to be expected. Burns, crushed limbs, and gas exposure were discussed in practical terms, as if they were occupational realities rather than failures of the system itself. By 1920, over 250,000 men were employed in iron and steel production nationwide. Even a small percentage of incidents translated into thousands of lives altered. So why did men keep showing up? I think the men working in this field felt they had no other choice. They had families to feed, with limited opportunities and limited skills. Yet, even as men felt trapped by circumstance, the reality was that safety was always a negotiation between what was possible and what was permissible. Safety measures existed, but they were limited by technology and culture. Protective clothing offered minimal insulation. Respiratory protection was rare. Training emphasized vigilance and experience, assuming danger could be managed through awareness alone. When fatalities occurred, investigations often focused on immediate causes. It was always blamed on the same reasons: a misstep, a delayed response, or a failed component. The unforgiving system itself was never pointed a finger at. Communities had no choice but to absorb these losses quietly. Families adjusted, companies hired replacements, and furnaces continued to burn. The continuity of work reinforced the idea that individual lives, while valued, were secondary to the operation as a whole. As the 1920s progressed, scale became the new threat. Blast furnaces grew larger, taller, and more productive. By 1925, the United States operated more than 400 blast furnaces. Each unit held more molten iron, more gas, and more stored energy than ever before. There was ongoing tension amongst the workers, questioning whether technology finally outpaced the margin for human control. Articles praised record outputs while warning that emergency response times had not improved at the same pace. The furnace was becoming too large to outrun, too powerful to easily tame once something went wrong. Power reached a breaking point, not because it lacked knowledge, but because growth magnified every consequence. Each improvement carried hidden weight, and each ton of added capacity narrowed the distance between control and catastrophe. Part 11. Conclusion. By the early 1930s, the iron industry had survived cycles of growth, collapse, and reform, carrying forward hard lessons written in heat and loss. The blast furnace remained, but the illusion of complete control did not. Design improvements slowly incorporated what experience had taught: better refractory materials, improved ventilation, and more systematic monitoring reduced some risks. Yet the core principle endured. Federal industrial reports from the early Depression years show production falling sharply, but furnaces that remained active continued to run for long campaigns rather than frequent shutdowns. Even in reduced markets, stopping entirely was avoided whenever possible. And while fatal accidents declined over time, they never vanished. Breakouts, gas incidents, and structural failures continued to appear in technical journals, described with increasing sophistication but familiar consequences. What changed most was perception. Early furnaces had been celebrated as symbols of progress. By the interwar years, they were understood as systems that demanded respect rather than optimism. Risk was no longer invisible, but it remained embedded. Regulations grew, and engineering standards tightened, and safety culture expanded. Yet none of this erased the fundamental reality of molten iron held in place by human design. Control improved, yet certainty did not. The legacy of the blast furnace lives on in modern steelmaking, in the acceptance that some machines cannot be made harmless, only managed. The eternal fire left behind more than iron. It left a lesson etched into industrial history that endurance without humility invites catastrophe, and that progress often advances only by learning how close it has already come to disaster. I hope you found this story to be insightful. There are so many lessons to be learned from the past, though as we move forward into an ever-changing world, we see the same components of greed and economics prevailing over the cost of human lives. Maybe one day, we'll get the message.